What are the commonalities among leaders who sustain excellence over an extended period of time?
Sebastian, so good to have you here on the Learning Leader Show. Welcome.
Well, thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
So I've been following you for a while. I started sending you, I think, whether it was to your contact form or to random people associated with you, I think I started sending you emails about 5 years ago. So whenever something's been a long time in the makings, it's extra special. So I appreciate you being here. And it was cool when your team member reached out just a little bit ago to set this up. And I want to start at maybe an interesting point, or maybe it's just more personal to me. And you became a dad a little bit later in life than most do. I believe you were 55 years old when you became a dad for the first time. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
I would love to hear, and you had a daughter, and I'm a dad of daughters as well. And I believe you have 2 daughters now, but I would love to hear how your life and your outlook on life changed when you became a dad for the first time.
Oh, well, very, very quickly, my life, I stopped being the point of my own life. Like, the point of my life is them. And I don't think that would necessarily have been true had I had children in my mid-20s. Maybe it shouldn't have been true. I mean, there's the different parts of your life are for different things, and this sort of the endeavor that many people go through when they're young of figuring themselves out and pursuing the world in the way that's most meaningful to them personally. That's a very important phase, and when you squash that, because you have obligations and commitments and that kind of thing, and it's a noble thing to do, and for many people it's the right thing to do, but sort of squashing that personal enterprise, that kind of personal enterprise, can also manifest itself in other ways that are complicated. So all that to say, for me, in my particular personal makeup, I think I wouldn't have been a great dad in my 20s. I think I would have had a conflict between myself and my children, my own desires and wanting my children. And now there's no conflict at all. There's nothing that I do on my own that even approaches in consequence and importance what I'm doing with my children. And I'm interested in all kinds of things, but not if it's in competition with my role as a dad. I love living in that kind of new way.
You've put yourself into some of the most dangerous places in the world. You could have been killed many times. We'll talk about that more later. If you were a dad earlier in your life, in your mid-20s, like some are, do you think you would have went to some of those scary places and embed yourself with our military heroes? Would you have done that type of work, do you think?
Yeah, and just to be clear, I was covering wars long before America was involved in a war. I was in Afghanistan in the mid-90s, during their civil war, and I was all over West Africa, conflicts that the U.S. had nothing to do with. But so I was really covering war, sort of capital W, and eventually I was with the American forces. That came rather late in my career. But that said, I think I probably would have done those things, and I think there would have been a conflict between my duties as a father and my aspirations as a journalist. I don't think they would have been able to. They wouldn't have coexisted very easily. So that's exactly what I'm talking about. There would have been a conflict.
Yeah.
It probably would have been resolved imperfectly on both sides. And now there's no conflict whatsoever. I have absolutely no desire to risk my life or even be away for any length of time. Forget it. I'm just not interested.
What was it, you think? Was it something in your upbringing? Because I know your dad is also a remarkable story. I'd love you to talk a little bit about him for a second. But what do you think it was in your upbringing to say, I want to go to dangerous places and tell the stories of the people who are fighting in these wars, and putting yourself in a position to where you're right there next to them. You're embedded. You're essentially have just as much risk as these people fighting these wars. Not, as you said, not just the ones that Americans are fighting in, but in all other places, civil wars, really dangerous places. What made you want to do that?
Well, my father was a refugee from 2 wars. He lived in Spain when during the fascist takeover under Franco, and they fled. They fled to France, and then they left again when the Nazis came in, and that's how we wound up in this country. So wars affected my family, and war. I grew up in a kind of comfortable American suburb, and in a lot of ways, I matured kind of late because that environment allows for that.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You don't have to grow up very fast in an affluent American suburb. You can delay it if you want. And I was sort of going through my 20s, and I was, whatever. I was doing some interesting things, but on some level, I felt like I hadn't really tested myself or proven myself. And I didn't know how that would be possible within this society. And I wanted to be a journalist. And there was a civil war in Bosnia, and it seemed like a very clear. It's never as clear cut as it seems, but it seemed like a sort of clear cut, much like the Spanish Civil War, sort of clear cut right versus wrong. And the Bosnian Serb army with tanks and artillery and everything else had besieged Sarajevo, which was a major population center, and was just shelling it to pieces and killing men, women, children, and the world wasn't doing anything. And I was like, that's where I want to be. It felt like it was a very clear case of injustice. And the idea that I could play a little role in illuminating that was like not just appealing, it was completely intoxicating. And
wow.
So what sent me to those places? A sense of adventure, a sense of wanting to prove myself, a sense of justice being denied to people that I could write about, a kind of professional ambition, going to a war zone is a shortcut to advancement as a journalist, and as it should be. I think it was a whole lot of different things.
I think it takes, though, immense guts that most people don't have. Where do those guts come from?
Well, I don't know about that. I mean, I was enormously scared before. I mean, now I look back, my experience in Sarajevo was pretty safe and benign. That would change in later wars, but that kind of thing is at its most frightening before you do it. And then once you're in that situation, it's the anxiety before the big game or whatever. Once you're in the middle of it, it seems dangerous but manageable. And so my greatest fear was before I flew into Sarajevo for the first time. I had no idea what I was doing, and I don't want to describe myself as courageous. I really don't think I am, but I think I have a formidable capacity for denial, and at a certain level of fear, I just put it in a box and I put it away. And I made my money. I mean, I wanted to be a journalist. I was sort of a freelance writer. Basically, I was a mess in my 20s, but I made my money. I made pretty good money as a climber for tree companies. I was a high climber, and I worked with a chainsaw on a rope 50 feet, 100 feet in the air, taking trees down from the top down, obviously potentially dangerous. And I got hurt pretty badly doing it. And I was very scared of heights. And so I just, but I'm on a rope with a chainsaw at 80 feet in the air. What do you do with your fear of heights? I knew how to put that fear into a box and put it away. So I wouldn't say I'm courageous. I would say that I have an amazing capacity for denial.
How would that, so I think somebody hearing that with a kind of a regular job was not necessarily what you've ever had. I wonder the takeaway for them, because I agree with you, especially with the background in athletics or getting ready to get on stage to give a big speech. The kind of the fear is almost this nervous anticipatory feeling of the event happening, whether it's the game or the speech or whatever it is, and you're kind of nervous. And then once you, like in football, I always wanted the ball first. We won the toss, we want the ball. I wanted to go first. I didn't want to wait, because you just want to get it started. The speech is like, kill the opener so that we can be into it. And I think that could be a good lesson for people in that, Sebastian. Maybe you could pull the thread on that a little bit for how to help people with regular jobs be able to put that fear in a box, so to speak, so that they could be better, whether it's leading their team at work or leading their families, either as well, the things that they're scared of. I'm curious what you think about that.
Well, I think there's some benefit in, I mean, people are naturally aversive of things that are scary, and be it a lion in the Serengeti or public speaking. Either way, it doesn't have to be a physical danger, but they're aversive of it because it feels bad and is dangerous in some way. And so I think with the things that aren't physically dangerous, that are just anxiety producing, or in physical danger as well, what you want is to feel that you have agency. And when you don't have agency, that's actually what's terrifying. If you're well trained and have agency, you can face very dangerous situations without a huge amount of psychic trauma, because you believe in your agency, you believe in your skills. So I'm going by memory here, but my last book, Tribe, I wrote about psychological trauma among frontline soldiers compared to rear-based soldiers in the Israeli army, in the IDF. And what they found was that the rear-based soldiers would get shelled randomly and were more scared. There were more psychiatric casualties in the rear bases proportionally from random shelling, because those soldiers, A, couldn't control the shelling, and B, weren't very well trained, compared to the frontline special ops troops. They had much higher casualty rates, but they were superbly well trained and had a sense of agency in the more dangerous environment. So I know it's a long digression, but basically do anything that gives you a feeling of agency. And often that means, punch first, literally or metaphorically, punch first. Don't wait around to react. Claim if you want to deal with your anxiety, claim the initiative and find your agency. There's also a kind of interesting physiological thing that happens. If you go in front of a mirror and there's something called the fear grimace, it's sort of like that, eyes wide, mouth pulled back. I mean, we all know what it looks like. If you do that in the mirror, you will actually feel a sort of flush of adrenaline go through your body.
Really?
The expression trigger, you will do that expression if you're scared unconsciously, but it goes both ways. If you make yourself do the expression and you can see yourself in the mirror, your body reacts. It's like, oh, I'm seeing another human being that's scared. Something dangerous is going on, and you get a bunch of adrenaline dumped in you, right? Well, there's another thing that happens with yawning. You cannot be scared and yawn at the same time. I mean, when you yawn, it means you, among other things, that your system is not prepared for an attack. And I ran a lot. I was an athlete when I was young. I was a track and cross country runner. And, the scaredest I'd ever been as a kid was right before the big meet when we're lining up for the 1,500 meter championship. I was a good runner. I ran a 4:12 mile when I was young, which is not world class, but it's pretty good, right?
That is zooming, man. That's sprinting 4 laps.
But I tell you, man, I was way more scared before those races than I ever was going into combat. And what I would do.
Really?
Yeah, and I won most of the races I ran, partly because I was at the Olympics, but I was competing in Division III college athletics in America. But what I would do is I would make myself yawn on the starting line right as we were lining up, waiting for the 3 commands, ready, set, go, gun, the gunshot for the signal. I would make myself yawn, and it did 2 things. It calmed me down. It also freaked everybody else out, because unconsciously, wow, this guy's got to be pretty relaxed to be yawning on the starting line. And so then I found this wonderful example of that. Once I yawned while a cop was talking to me. He pulled me over for speeding, and I yawned right as he was talking to me. And cops count. I mean, I know a lot of cops. I love cops. Good cops are amazing people. Bad cops aren't, but whatever. I know a number of cops. I'm really fond of them. And I know that they count as an unsafe job. And they count on a certain amount of intimidation to keep the situation from escalating and keep themselves safe, blah, blah, blah. So the last thing they want is some kid yawning in their face while they're, and it really pissed them off, right? Yeah. On this sort of primate level. I was being insulting to the alpha male. I wasn't being properly deferential, and I could see it really annoyed him. But at any rate, so this amazing anecdote on sort of larger scale, when King Darius, the king of Persia, many centuries ago, and don't ask me how many because I can't remember, but anyway, a very long time ago, when Darius tried to defeat the Scythians in northern, I think they were in northern Iran. He rode forth with the largest army ever assembled, right, to confront and defeat the Scythians, who were these like nomadic, pot-smoking, like long-haired, crazy nomads and amazing warriors. It might have been like the Comanche or something, right, the equivalent. And so the Scythian army, such as it was, sort of drew itself up before King Darius's, the most powerful army ever assembled. And they, and right before the big climactic battle, the Scythians, they noticed that there were rabbits in the underbrush all around them. And waiting for the battle to start, the Scythian warriors started hunting rabbits because they wanted to make sure they had something to eat after the battle, right? And Darius, it's the equivalent of yawning in front of a cock, right?
Yeah.
Darius was so freaked out that they were so calm. They're like, oh, we'll just hunt rabbits while we're waiting for the apocalyptic clash of armies. He was so freaked out by their sort of lack of concern that he was like, they must know something that I don't. They clearly think they're going to win. I'm out of here. And he withdrew his great army.
Wow. So side note, your books. So I've watched Restrepo, Perfect Storm, right? You made the award-winning documentary Restrepo, blew my mind. The Perfect Storm, you wrote that story, which then turned into more people maybe know it as a movie if they're honest with themselves. I did initially. Tribe just blew me away, and now Freedom, your latest book. And one of the things, Sebastian, that I think I'm blown away is your depth of research and knowledge, and you just kind of pulled a story out of nowhere that I've never really heard or remember. And in a way, I have to ask, like, what is your process to do this intense research, to have these really historical facts and stories, which stories are even better, as you know, these stories, it's at the tip of your tongue, ready to go, not knowing what I'm going to ask you. And it's like, boom, this will work here. What's your process to kind of download all of that into your mind?
Well, I mean, thank you. It's a flattering question. I'm not sure it's entirely deserved, but I'm fascinated by the world, and I've been collecting odd bits of information my whole life, and then I do research on, starting at those odd bits of information. And when I wrote Freedom, so my book Freedom is basically about how humans maintain their autonomy in the face of a greater power. And have for millennia. And I really thought deeply about, forget about all the sort of awful political associations with the word freedom right now. The word's horribly misused in politics. I'm not interested in that at all. I was really interested on a sort of animal level. We humans are social primates, right? We are our next of kin in the mammalian world are chimpanzees that have a top-down male hierarchy that dominates everything, right? We don't have that. We're not subject to the whims of the largest male or the largest group of males, right? We have autonomy. How is that possible that a smaller group, like the Scythians, can actually remain autonomous in the face of the greatest army ever assembled? The Montenegrins in the early 1600s. A wild mountain tribe faced the Ottoman Empire as it marched into Montenegro, and they were outnumbered 12-1, and the Montenegrins destroyed them, right? And they did it over and over again. If humans weren't capable of this incredible feat of defeating a greater power, there would be no freedom, there'd be no autonomy, and the world would be dominated by these sort of basically fascist megastates. But that's not what the world looks like. So how does that work? So I am answering your question. It's just taking me a while. So basically, I was like, okay, one way to remain free is to be very mobile. So the Apache, I knew in the American Southwest, there were the Pueblo tribes that were very wealthy because they practiced agriculture, but that meant they were sort of like anchored to their town and to their fields. And then there were the Apache that were very mobile and materially poor. Now, who lasted longer as an autonomous people? The Pueblo got rolled immediately by the Spaniards. They could not defeat them in, open battle. The Apache never had an open battle. They were like, why would we do that? We can just run away and ambush people when the odds are advantageous and then run away again. And that mobility gave them their autonomy almost to within my grandmother's lifetime. I mean, they were finally fully rounded up in 1886, right? I mean, Western society had invented the machine gun, the four-stroke engine, the electric light, and the telephone, I think. I can't remember exactly, but whatever. We were a fully modern society at that point. There were free Apaches still running around, autonomous, right? So the book is divided into run, fight, think. You outrun your oppressor. If you can't do that, you're going to have to outfight him. And if you can't do that, you're going to have to outthink him. And so to answer your question, once I have an organizing principle, I know what directions to go in terms of my research. And that organizing principle itself comes from a lot of wide, reading and thinking and, research and what have you. But then once you have it, then you have a roadmap for where you're trying to go. And an organizing principle really is, if you don't have that, everything's just random information and it's very hard to retain. You need that sort of organizing principle to make sense of the world. And that to me is gold. I mean, that's like the tripartite structure of run, fight, think is like, that's why Freedom's a good book. That's why it was an interesting book to me to write. Without that organizing principle, it's just a bunch of interesting anecdotes.
Awesome book to read. You could do it in a day too. For people who are intimidated by longer books, you won't be by this one. And I think that's also another, from a writer's perspective of having writer envy of being able to put so much into so few words. Like that's the essence of what anyone who writes is trying to do, and most of us fail. Another good part. But I'm curious. So with a book called Freedom, and you analyze your life and everything that's happened to you and the things you've chosen to do, when would you say you've been the most free in your life?
Well, thank you for the question, because that brings up the other part of my book, Freedom, that I hadn't mentioned. So I decided to take a walking trip with 3 other guys that I was very close to. I don't say who we are. I just talk in the book. I refer to us collectively as we, or individually as one, one of us. Like I don't identify us, because I don't want us to be the point of the book. But this group of 4 men, including me, we and my dog Daisy, we walked along the railroad lines, this sort of weird swath of no man's land that just crisscrosses America. We walked from Washington, D.C. to Philadelphia, and then we turned west and headed for Pittsburgh. And we were living rough. I mean, we were carrying all our gear. We were sleeping under bridges and abandoned buildings or out in the woods. We got our water out of creeks. We cooked on fire. We had to hide from the police. At one point, the police were looking for us with a helicopter, which I felt a little bad about, but they never got us. It's illegal, of course, to walk along the railroad lines. And but you meet America from the inside out. I mean, it goes right through the ghettos, right through the farms, the suburbs. It goes through everything, through the middle of everything. And it's just weird no man's land, and you can make your way through there and no one will ever know except the other sort of vagrancy kind of people that are out there. We called it high-speed vagrancy. We moved fast, 10, 15, 20 miles a day. Once we did 40, what I call 40 and 40 miles in 40 hours. We're not ultra marathoners running with aid stations. We're carrying full load, 60 pounds on our back. Moving that fast hurts. And that was, arguably the freest I've ever been. I mean, as I say in my book, over 400 miles, most nights we were the only people who knew where we were. There are many definitions of freedom, but surely that's one of them. And it came at a great cost. I mean, physically, it was hard out there. We got hot, we got colds, we had no tent, so we were exposed to the elements. We were hungry, we had to cook all our own food. The water sometimes made us sick. We drank from the Youghiogheny River, and one guy was sick for a week. I wasn't, but his stomach, whatever, reacted to it. And but freedom, basically the safer and more comfortable you are, the less autonomous you are, because that safety and comfort comes from the group, the system that you're part of. And when you're not part of that system, you have more autonomy, but it hurts more. Like it's less safe. And each person has their own sort of like sweet spot of that balance of autonomy versus safety and comfort. But for us, we were maximally uncomfortable and fairly unsafe. I mean, railroads are dangerous environments, but we were completely autonomous for a little while, and it felt awfully good.
Why'd you do that?
I wanted to know what it felt like. I mean, really, there was no end goal involved. I didn't know I was going to write a book about it. I did make a documentary called The Last Patrol. One of the guys in the group shot video, and we made a documentary for HBO called The Last Patrol. But after that project finished, we kept going. I mean, I kept going out there because we loved it so much. It's like I think why some people like sail across the ocean. You are completely on your own out there. Like it is really on you. And that we got some guys started shooting at us in Pennsylvania. I mean, it was a weird environment. What can I say? But it was the weirdness that I liked about it, and the sort of problem solving that we had to do to stay alive and safe.
Let's take me back to some nights during the last patrol, and I'm curious. We all have thoughts when we lay down to go to bed, and most of us lay in a really comfortable bed. If we're lucky, next to an incredible spouse, like I get to, and you do now. And but when you're on the last patrol and you're under the stars, or you're under a bridge, or wherever you may be, can you remember or take us inside? What are some of the things you would think about when you're trying to go to sleep?
Oh, well, it's always safety first. Like, are we safe here? And there's whatever. We're in a pretty rural, rough area. There's guys.
In that case, it's safety first. For us, we're not thinking. When most of us go to bed, we're not thinking are we safe. We're laying in a very nice, cozy bed. So that's like already, like, for you, it's obvious, but most people haven't done that.
Right. And what I would say is that the circumstances. I mean, but the family that I have, we live in a very safe situation. I mean, meaning that we live in modern American society, and it's the most fulfilling, amazing thing I've ever experienced. But if you just set that aside for a moment, other than that, the most meaningful, sometimes the most fun, the most intense, the most memorable, the most productive experiences of my life have been the ones in which I was physically the dirtiest. Like literally, my body was dirty because I hadn't bathed in a long time, and or where security was a concern, or the basic processes of survival dominated my activities during the day. And so what I would say is, until you have children, until you have a family, up until that point, safety and comfort are overrated. And even with a family, I think their safety is never overrated, but comfort is. Convenience is overrated. It is it's not gratifying in a long-term way. We're wired to seek it because humans evolved in very harsh circumstances. So if something feels safe and comfortable and restful and convenient, we have evolutionary wiring that propels us towards that, but we have, as a society, have solved all of those problems. So a whole aspect of the amazing human animal and human mind that is devoted to the struggle of survival and the problem solving that comes with that struggle, that whole aspect of the human creature is underutilized in modern society, and I think it leaves people feeling, I don't know, less significant, less
fulfilled,
less fulfilled. Yeah.
What about what?
Yeah.
So now as a dad, and I think about this all the time. You can give them everything they want and need. You've worked hard in order to do that, but that may not be what's best for them. In fact, it's probably not, right? As you've said, some of those meaningful experiences are when you were dirty, when you weren't necessarily safe. And I think as a parent, part of our job is to help raise our children to I think leave a positive impact in the world, and also to be great without us. So how do you, will you take your daughters with you on a last patrol type endeavor? Will you do something different? How do you view that for them in order to help them be in a position to push their edges, to get outside of their zone of comfort and competency? What will you do to help them as a dad?
I wouldn't take them onto the railroad environment. It is too dangerous, and it wouldn't go. But I have a 4-year-old and another little girl is 1.5 years, and before the birth of the second girl, I'd been in Liberia in West Africa during the Civil War, a very frightening time in my life. And now it's a peaceful country, but it's, one of the poorest countries in the world. So my wife and I and our daughter, who was like 2.5 at the time, we went to Liberia. And it wasn't unsafe in any way whatsoever, but it's a rough country. It's a rough neighborhood. I never ever felt like our lives were in any way endangered, but it certainly didn't, it didn't feel convenient and luxurious and clean or whatever. But that's important. We're animals. Humans are animals. We're social primates, and the core human value is closeness. Right? That's the thing that children want and that adults need, that everyone needs. And we sleep with our children on the floor and on a large mattress. Like, we have a sort of sleeping area, and so we sleep with the girls. And
that's how you sleep currently in New York?
Yeah.
Really?
We never had a stroll. I mean, look, humans for hundreds of thousands. Tens of thousands of years obviously slept with their children. Like, if you went backpacking in the Bob Marshall Wilderness area, you wouldn't have a separate tent for your children, right? Like, you'd all be in a tent together, right? For sure. So then why do that differently in an apartment? The apartment is just a sophisticated tent, right? I mean, essentially, just because there's no physical risk, there are no grizzly bears in New York, doesn't mean that humans aren't wired, and particularly human children, are completely wired for proximity to their parents, because they're totally defenseless. And they don't know, the 6-month-old doesn't know that it's not in Bob Marshall Wilderness area, right? All it knows is that its safety comes from being in physical contact with its parents or some adults, right? And so, that's the human design, the human evolution, and that's been true for tens of thousands, hundreds, 100,000 years. We don't use a stroller. Children are a pleasure to carry. I carry 70 pounds, 400 miles. Like, I can put my 4-year-old on my back or on my shoulders, have my 1.5-year-old on my chest. What is that? Maybe 60 pounds? Where can I go with 60 pounds? I can walk all day with 60 pounds. And you get the pleasure. I mean, for 100,000 years, adults have carried their children until the children were big enough to walk. And you get a wonderful closeness. You feel them and they feel you, So at any rate, like that, what children want is closeness. Yeah. And when you give them closeness, they have the security with which to explore and be daring and courageous and adventurous and not need you. That's what physical closeness produces. And, I was put in my own bedroom from day one, literally. And I was, anxiety levels in this society are astronomically high. And, may partly be because children are, shut into dark rooms from day one. And, baby primates know that they're not safe in a dark, alone. I mean, they just were wired to know that that's not a safe environment as a young primate.
Why do you think we do that?
I mean, most people don't. I mean, most of the world doesn't do that. I mean, this is entirely, English society derived from English society. I mean, this is the English child raising tradition starting about 200 years ago, and all of the parts of the world that the British Empire sort of touched and colonized. That is how children are raised in those parts of the world, and only started a couple of hundred years ago.
Huh.
Otherwise, through most of the world, and certainly through most of human history, people keep their children very close because it's a dangerous world.
Huh.
And that closeness allows children to be enormoususly courageous and adventurous. They know that they're loved and they're connected. So to answer your question, give your children what they want. Yeah, absolutely. When it's in keeping with these core human evolutionary experiences. Our daughters also want, listen, the iPhone is unbearably appealing to the child, right? And to the adult. I have a flip phone. I don't touch those damn things, right? But it's designed, it's clearly addictive, right? Very, very clearly, the adult behavior around the smartphone is an addictive behavior,
Mm-hmm.
right? And the fact that a 3-year-old can manipulate an iPhone within 20 minutes knows how to work an iPhone and will sit there for hours oblivious to everything around him or her playing with this thing, that's clearly an addictive relationship to that device. So do we give our daughter an iPhone? No, of course we don't. Like, I also not, if she wants to try smoking, I'm not going to let her smoke. Why would you give your child an addictive, a pathway to addiction at a very young age? Eventually she's going to have her first cigarette, you know what I mean? Like I did. Eventually, someday she'll have a phone, but I'm certainly not going to give her one because she wants one. That will lead her away from a biological and evolutionary truth, which is that humans are social primates. Lead her away from that into sort of solipsistic digital universe that clearly isn't producing very good outcomes in our society.
Wow. We probably need to have a separate conversation so I can get parenting advice from you, Sebastian. But in the meantime, I want to ask you a question about Tribe. So most recent books, Freedom. It's obviously we're gonna be oscillating back and forth here for the rest of our time talking. But there's a section in Tribe that I highlighted years ago when I read it. It said human beings need 3 basic things in order to be content. They need to feel competent at what they do. They need to feel authentic in their lives, and they need to feel connected to others. These values are considered intrinsic to human happiness and far outweigh extrinsic values such as beauty, money, and status. And I really identify with this and thought about it a lot because at times, like a friend of mine named Jason Gaynard said, I was living my life to impress people that I didn't care about. And once I stopped, that is when everything changed for me. And I was like, that's a great point, right? Like looking for a certain car or whatever, the values. And when you talk about feeling competent in what they do and authentic in their lives and connected to other people, I really felt that. Can you share more about, and that's an excerpt from a brief quote from Tribe, one of your previous books, what that's all about when it means to feel content?
Okay, and let me just say that those 3 attributes, I myself was citing another study.
Okay.
Located healthy sense of self-worth and meaningfulness and contentedness in those attributes, right? So I'm citing someone else. Those, I did not come up with those, but I obviously agree with them or they wouldn't have been in my book.
Mm-hmm.
So what you have to assume is that human behaviors are adaptive, evolved over many thousands, tens of thousands of years to produce good outcomes in our primordial environment, which if people are acquisitive, if they sort of want to acquire things, that's an adaptive behavior in a dangerous natural environment where you can starve to death, right? In a modern society where it's very easy to buy more things that you can possibly use, that adaptive acquisitiveness can become counterproductive. So what you have to understand is that when people try to impress others, that's an adaptive response, because of course, if you're living in a survival group of 30 or 40 individuals in our primordial past, where everyone is sort of relying on everyone else to be competent and authentic, right? And skilled at what they do, whether it be it hunting or weaving baskets or starting a fire or fighting or whatever it may be, displaying, impressing others with your competence is a crucial way of making sure that you are safely embedded in the survival group, because if you're not, you're dead. No one survives by themselves in nature. You die immediately, right? So showing your competence and impressing other people with what a significant person you are is adaptive in a small scale survival society, right? You take that adaptive behavior and you have a young person or older person who's trying to impress millions of people they'll never know, who aren't depending on them, and vice versa. It's an endless task. You'll never win. You know, it's like your email. It's like social media. No matter how fast you do your email, no matter how diligent you are in returning emails and texts and attending to social media, the more you do that, the more there is to do. It actually creates more work. I mean, it's the opposite of freedom, just like quicksand is the opposite of freedom, in the sense that the thing you do to get clear of it actually embeds you deeper in the thing that's trapping you, right? So likewise, trying to impress other people, you'll never do it. And you do these displays that will never quite do the trick in terms of making you feel, oh, I've arrived. Now people think I'm an impressive person. Some of the most insecure, anxious, miserable people there are people who, what was that list again? Are wealthy, high status, and beautiful, right? I mean, those people never seem to end their quest for affirmation. Whatever your politics, I think people on both sides of the political spectrum recognize a rather tragic figure in Donald Trump, of someone who just, I think, and my heart, I didn't vote for him, but my heart kind of goes out to him in some ways. He seems like he was such an insecure person that there was sort of no end to the amount of approval and applause that he needed to get. What a heartbreaking thing, And I don't think he was a good thing for our country, but just as a human being, like what happened in that person's childhood that produced such a cripplingly insecure person? Like it's probably criminal what happened in his childhood.
Yeah. I think that's why that book and Tribe spoke to me, also because I want to talk about this relates a little bit to the working world, and why I'm kind of grateful for my parents, really my family, for putting me in a position to be a part of a team. As mentioned, you were on sports teams, you're a great runner, individual in its pursuit, but also you're with others, you're in a team. And I think a locker room is an incredible learning experience for people. Certainly for me, because you get recruited to go to a college, you all come there, for the most part, everyone's on scholarship. There are some walk-ons, but for the most part, you're all there. You're from wildly different backgrounds, different parts of the country, and in some cases out of the country, but different parts of the world, different parenting situations, different upbringings, different levels of status, right? All of that comes in. And yet you come into the locker room, and the best teams, the ones who are most effective, understand the common goal and understand that we need each other, and understand how to hold each other accountable, and understand how to work hard towards that common goal. And when it goes well, all of that is there's this synergistic effect amongst the team, and it's beautiful. And I've also been on losing teams, Sebastian, and that doesn't work as well. And you being embedded within the military world and seeing people at war, both Americans as well as those outside of our country, have got to witness that. And so when you think about the collaboration inside a locker room, and the collaboration in a foxhole, or the collaboration amongst our military heroes who fight for freedom, what's your thought process on the thought of needing one another, of being side by side with another person, with fighting for a common goal, whether it's in athletics or in your case is more life and death when it comes to war?
Well, I think modern war and contemporary athletics basically reproduce um, our evolutionary past, and things that feel sort of meaningful and gratifying, as frankly war can for young fighters, and sports certainly can be those things. Um, Often things feel meaningful and gratifying because we're adaptive in our evolutionary past, and so typically it's not, the endeavor isn't with one other person, it's with a group. Humans did a lot of dangerous things when we, in our prehistory, in our history. Hunting big animals was a group endeavor that required everyone to trust everyone else, because all you have is a spear and you're going up against a mastodon or a tiger or whatever, a dangerous animals. And obviously war is that times 1,000, right? I mean, if you're in a group that is coordinated and devoted to itself, you're just tactically more successful, more proficient than a group that's not, where the individuals are not devoted to each other and don't feel a sort of unification. Clearly Saddam Hussein's huge armies did not feel that sort of profound cohesiveness and devotion to each other that is required for effective combat. And, they folded very, very quickly when fighting the Americans twice. And, there are groups that have had way less armament than Saddam Hussein's armies. I mean, the Taliban fought us to a standstill over 20 years. We finally left on their terms, right? They didn't have an air force, they didn't have artillery, they didn't have tanks, a lot of them didn't have boots. So that sort of core commitment to the group can be tactically crucial for an underdog to win a fight. And I loathe the Taliban, right? But as I said, if groups like that weren't able to defeat an empire, autonomy would not be possible. And the Taliban, we can have that conversation. It's a loathsome political and religious ideology, but there is something hopeful in the fact that a small group can defeat a larger group. And so that, sports play to all of that. And the loss of self, people like losing. I mean, look, being sort of ego-driven makes sense, but it's also a kind of emotional burden. And when you're a parent, the focus of your concern becomes your children, and you lose this sort of awful sense of like this burden of being the most important thing in your life. Well, likewise in a platoon in combat, in a healthy platoon, I mean, one that's functioning well and is well trained, the individuals in it are at least as concerned with the welfare of the group as they are with their own welfare, at least as concerned, if not way more so. And that feels good. And when you experience that in a team, that loss of self, where all of a sudden you seem to be playing you're sort of, the whole team is coordinated like it's one organism, and everyone's playing like unconsciously, like beyond their individual abilities, and it's all clicking and coming together. That's a very powerful drug. It happens in combat, it happens in sports. It's clearly adaptive to have that. It's in what Mikhail Csikszentmihalyi, the great Czech psychological researcher, called a state of flow, right? It's clearly adaptive and made humans very effective warriors and very effective hunters. And honestly, we as humans, we love it.
I saw you give a talk at a church of all places, which you can share more about that background. And I watched you talk, and I believe you were sick too, which made it even more impressive. But one of the things you talked about was the difference between running a company versus leading a company. And I think you said something like, I'm not really sure how to run a company, but I think I know how to lead one. What's the difference between running a company and leading one?
So leaders Leaders are people who are willing to sacrifice the consequences of their decisions along with the people they lead. So a war leader who says, take the hill, is the first out of the trench. And if anyone's going to get shot, he's willing to risk getting shot along with them, right? So the kings of Europe, until about 1400, the kings of Europe would often, when they went to war, would lead on horseback their own men into combat, sword in hand, right, into the fray, and would die. I mean, the last European king to die in combat was, if I remember correctly, in the late 1300s. And after that, kings told men to go to war without them, to fight, do their fighting and dying for them. And the kings did not risk themselves. At that point, they stopped being leaders, and they started being opportunists. So a corporate leader who receives a huge year-end bonus while people are being laid off or experiencing reductions in their salaries is not a leader. You have to, as a leader, as a president, as an American president, as a military commander, at least in the, the foxholes of Afghanistan, not the generals, of course, that's a different job. Or as a corporate leader, in order to be a leader, you have to be very willing and eager to suffer consequences along with the people that are who are trusting you. And when you don't, when you hide behind them financially and you give yourself a huge bonus while the company's taking a hit, when you tell people to run into machine gun fire and you're not willing to, or as a president, if you are unwilling to acknowledge your mistakes and your deficits, you are not a leader, you're an opportunist. And, Western society is wealthy and affluent, and we can survive opportunists. It's not going to lead to the collapse of society. We just don't need to use up the beautiful word leadership on those people.
I think one of the examples you use, and I want to expand on this one, is the Chobani founder, Hamdi Ulukaya. I may probably pronouncing that wrong. He said in his company, all employees are part owners of the company, and that you share that he comes from a family of nomadic sheep farmers from the Turkish mountains. And he learned a collective approach to life and work where he grew up. And that's leadership. I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah. I sat next to him at a dinner, and all I know about him is from that conversation. Mm-hmm. And I didn't follow up. And so he's not in my book, Freedom. And I've just read that there have been some sort of complicated events with his company. But I will say is the idea that he is reproducing our evolutionary origins. When you make your, basically Chobani, he started it with, basically pennies in his pocket as an immigrant to this country, and built it up into this huge empire, really from scratch. And he, when you make the people who are working in your company part of the company, where they suffer the downturns and the upturns collectively, as does the leadership, you're basically reproducing our evolutionary past. And in our evolutionary past, the upturns and downturns go to our physical survival and the amount of food that we have, not the amount of money we have. But basically, when you reproduce that in a capitalist society with people, instead of being wage labor, having a personal investment in the outcome of the company, and you yourself foregoing excessive payments if things are going poorly, then you're basically reproducing the dynamics of our evolutionary past, and that tends to work very, very well, resonates very deeply with people. People do that naturally during a disaster, earthquakes, hurricanes, tornadoes, bombardments. People revert to that kind of egalitarian thinking very, very quickly during a disaster.
Sebastian, you've spent time around a number of the world's most impactful and effective leaders. And I'm curious, from your perspective, when you think about some of the common behaviors and attitudes and mindsets of those leaders who have sustained excellence over an extended period of time? What are some of those behaviors and themes you found?
I think excellent leaders believe in a principle, and for political leaders in this country, what I would hope is that the highest principle would be democracy and the democratic process, regardless of party or personal political ambition. I think both sides fail at that more often than they succeed. But I think that's a mark of real leadership. And I think a willingness to sacrifice one's own interests or life, as I said, for the interests of the group is crucial to powerful leadership. Everything else isn't leadership, right? I mean, it's just part of the definition of the word is that you are leading from the front, either literally or metaphorically. Michael Connolly, who was the head of the the Easter Rising in Dublin in 1916, he was the general of the rising, right? He was the general Petraeus, basically, of the Irish rebels in Dublin. And it was all his aides could do to drag him out of gunfire because he kept exposing himself to risk rather than telling someone else to do something risky when he had to scout out a location to put some sandbags on the street or whatever. And he just was like completely careless about gunfire. He shot twice in 1 week, right? Because he was putting himself at risk rather than putting other people at risk. That's the kind of leaders that we deserve. I've seen it in the U.S. military. I've seen it in private enterprise. I wrote about a guy at the end of Tribe who had his company, his small company, had suffered a downturn. 20 employees. He was in New York City some decades ago. a downturn during the 1980s, and he took a massive pay cut. I think he took no salary at all for a year so that he wouldn't have to fire anybody. And he never told anyone. It was the accountant for the company that spilled the beans and told everyone that their boss and the owner of the company had skipped a year's salary so that no one else would have to take a pay cut or get fired. And then you put that alongside those people on Wall Street during the 2008 economic collapse that were taking hundreds of millions of dollars in bonuses while their companies collapsed and they bankrupted this country. That's not leadership. Essentially that's fraud.
Wow. Even the impressive part is the leader who does that and just doesn't tell anybody, right? They're not trying to get accolades or get stories written about them or even kind of humble brag, or I don't know what you'd call that. They just do it. It's the right thing to do. One more question, Sebastian. I'd have to imagine you just got bombarded from people in all ages, but specifically thinking of people who are a little bit earlier in their career. Maybe they recently graduated college and they want to put a dent in the world, right? Help people, make a difference in a good way. What are some general pieces of life/career advice you'd give to somebody in that stage?
It's really important to fail. If you fail, it means that you're trying to do things that you're not sure you can succeed at. And it's a sign that you're undoubtedly learning and growing and probably benefiting from your experiences. If you never fail, it means you're not near the limits of your capabilities. And so you won't thrive. I mean, you might, hopefully you will have a life that's so successful on some level, but the fear of failure can be crippling to someone's development, and you must go for it. And the sign that you're sort of failing at things regularly means that you're pushing the envelope. At some point, if you keep failing at one thing, ceramics just may not be the career choice for you, whatever. At some point you have to be a realist, but this, I feel like that we live in a culture of sort of like where there's this brutal imperative of success. And, I think that the only way to achieve that is to avoid anything where there's the tiniest risk of failure. That's a miserable way to live.
Oh, it's so good. Constantly pushing your edges. That's how they get wider, right? Thank you so much, Sebastian. The book is called Freedom. I encourage people to read Tribe as well if you haven't read either one, but the most recent one's called Freedom. It's so good. You could do it in a day. It's this beautiful combination of like historical references that are so tight and well told, plus the story of this last patrol. That again, I don't really know how you do it. It would take a whole another day's worth for me to figure that out, and I'm not even going to try. I'm just going to appreciate it and acknowledge it and say thank you so much for doing it, man, and thank you for being here.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you. I hope you all enjoy my book, and it was a real pleasure talking to you.
Thanks so much, man. I'd love to continue our dialogue as we both progress. As the world's opening up, it'd be so good to meet you in person at some point.
Yeah, be in touch.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Sebastian.
Take care.